Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm very excited to welcome Brendan Cassidy to the podcast today to talk about Johnny Got His Gun, the one and only film directed by the Oscar-winning screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, which premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 1971 and was released to theaters in August of 71. How are we doing, Brendan?
We're doing good. It's finally getting warm here in Pennsylvania, where I'm residing. Went for a good run just afterwards, and now it's fun. I like to, I like to try and get out and be healthy, and then I like to try and be as nerdy as possible when I get back to my apartment, talking movies with someone like you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for being here.
Yeah,
I just went for a run as well, and it's still really cold, and I had to wear like many layers. So I'm jealous.
Well, the downside is that we have the humidity that compensates for the cool weather. So that's kind of what makes it creates the illusion that it's warmer than it actually is.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
had you heard of this film before, Johnny Got His Gun?
I have, not because of the reputation of Dalton Trumbo or the film itself. I've heard of it because of the music video for the song One by Metallica.
video.
Yeah. So that's how I heard of it, through my musicality side of my brain. But that's really the only extent of it, aside from the fact that it was Dalton Trumbo's only directorial effort, as you were talking about.
Yeah, this is a guy. I mean, I just looked at his filmography this morning. So many credits going all the way back to the 1930s. He passed away, I believe, in 1976. So between like mid 30s to mid 70s, he was active when he could be.
Yeah,
as we'll talk about
that. Yeah,
and if any of you have seen the 2015 film Trumbo, starring Bryan Cranston, goes into a lot of his life and a lot of the problems he had to deal with in Hollywood for many years.
Yeah.
But halfway
and
through,
that was honestly the extent of my knowledge of Dalton Trumbo as I was getting into film, was that film starring Bryan Cranston, which was sort of my introduction to his life. And ironically, looking back on that, I don't remember much of that film outside of Bryan Cranston's really good performance. But aside from that, it's not much to remember.
6 years on, I remember I really liked it at the time, but 6 years on,
I didn't hate it.
6 years on, all I remember is him in the bathtub typing.
yeah, that was sort of the marketing image for the movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So before we get to Johnny Got His Gun, which I keep wanting to call Annie Get Your Gun. I don't know about you, but I have to really focus.
well, again, the musicality side of my brain wants to say Janie's got a gun.
Janie's got a gun.
Yeah.
And then his name in the movie is Joe, not Johnny.
Yeah,
so that was
Johnny.
confusing.
Yeah.
But before we get
close enough.
It's close enough. So before we get to that, I wanted to ask about you. I wanted to ask, what role has film played in your life? And if you have any favorites you could share with us of any genre from childhood to now, what are some of your favorites?
That will be like an hour-long conversation.
Okay.
So I'll try and keep
the next hour.
Next hour. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. But it basically started since I was like 3 years old. Disney movies was really kind of my introduction to just loving movies in general, and just the narrative and the worlds that it can take you to. And since then, I've always had a love for it, just constantly growing and becoming more nerdy and analytical the older that I get, which I love. I love doing that, and it's made me more open-minded to various types of movies. I don't look at movies from a genre standpoint anymore like I used to when I was a lot younger. I look at a movie as maybe like the great Roger Ebert would say, is how a movie is about. It's whether it's functioning as it's intended to do. Like, what is the movie's intent, and whether it achieves that. And I like very humanistic films as I've gotten older too. So as far as a few favorites, that's like the most impossible task to ask any film critic, honestly. I feel like they change a lot, but
yeah,
some of the ones that have had the most impact on me, I often always cite Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind as my favorite movie.
Okay.
Primarily because it was kind of my turning point in life, in college. I was a senior, very unsure about what I was going to do after I graduated, and that movie, for better and for worse, kind of gave me the push about understanding taking risks and embracing the unknown, and how that could also affect your family too, kind of looking at it from both sides. And that movie kind of did that for me and made me look at it in multiple angles. So a movie like that, alongside, we were talking offline, I'm a big Charlie Chaplin fan. Probably is my favorite filmmaker. So I guess my second favorite now would probably be something like City Lights from 1931. My go-to movie whenever I need at least some sense of joy And we all needed that in 2020. So I may have watched
Mhm.
that film at least 17 times. And
Wow.
coincidentally, my co-host on In Session Film, we actually did a Charlie Chaplin movie series, and it gave me yet another excuse to talk about that alongside his main filmography of feature films and not just his shorts, which was a lot of fun.
Oh, fantastic. You
Yeah.
bring up Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I always just think about that movie. What an amazing follow-up to Jaws. You think
Mm-hmm.
after Jaws and that insane success that he would have been like, oh, God, follow it up with something that's maybe not quite as good, or like, and for
Yeah.
him to hit it out of the park twice in a row like that was pretty extraordinary.
And I feel like in a lot of ways, Close Encounters is sort of the initial blueprint of what a Spielberg film would become.
Mhm.
Because Jaws was very much a thriller, but Close Encounters was sort of embracing that suburban sentimentality that Spielberg
Mhm.
became very known for, especially with movies like E.T. in the
Yeah.
80s. But a lot of that was set because of Close Encounters. It even has like that sense of adventure that we'd see in maybe an Indiana Jones movie. So it's like an initial greatest hits of sorts without it actually being, a collection of familiar
Mhm.
hits. It's sort of new.
Yeah, we're going to talk about double feature ideas later for our featured film today. But when I think
Yeah.
of Spielberg, I think of two great double features: our Duel with Jaws, which
Mhm.
have a lot of similarities,
For
and
sure. Yeah.
Close Encounters with E.T., which
Yeah.
E.T., I think he even talks about on the Blu-ray, like in an interview, like, yeah, it's kind of like where Close Encounters leaves off. It's kind of like almost a spiritual
Yeah.
sequel in a way. Like, what
Yeah.
if one
Yeah.
of the aliens had stayed?
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And I always thought about that. I'm actually glad it wasn't as, I guess, canon like that. I'm glad
Yeah.
it kind of exists in its own world. It's not
Yeah.
too literal. The world of cinematic universes these days, not everything has to tie together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You also are a film critic for In Session Film. Can you talk
Mhm.
about this company and how long you've been working for it, and yeah,
Yeah.
what's some of the articles you've written for In Session Film?
Yeah, so I don't do many writing pieces there. I used to do a
Okay,
little bit more, but we've since expanded our writing staff there,
okay,
so they handle most of that portion. And my co-host JD Duran basically runs the entire gambit of In Session Film with our good friend Ryan McQuaid, who works as associate editor, kind of overseeing a lot of the written work. But myself and JD, we are the runners of the main show, which is sort of what started In Session Film as like the bread and butter of the entire site. It was a movie podcast site, and then sort of
oh,
expanded
gotcha.
to be a little bit more than just that. The main show is still going strong with he and I. Trying to review a new release and maybe doing a top 3 list that's inspired by that new release, or maybe a movie series, for instance.
Hmm.
We're in the middle of doing a Terrence Malick movie series right now, which is a lot of fun because we love Terrence Malick, even though we know a lot of people do not. So it's sort of interesting to talk about that. We also have a second show called Extra Film that Ryan McQuaid hosts with another good friend, Jay Ledbetter, and that's more geared towards like the smaller films or the indies that we don't have time for in the main show, in
Okay.
addition to other movie series that they do, such as Billy Wilder that they're doing right now. So 2 simultaneous shows with different angles, but has since expanded quite heavily.
Fantastic. I did find one article. I think it was your top 10 films of 2019.
Oh
Believe that
yeah,
you wrote for the
yeah.
In Session Film.
I always write up the top 10 lists
Okay.
for each given year. So as I said, I don't do much writing now as far as like reviews or other think pieces. Really the extent of my writing, just due to time,
Mm.
is just when we get to the end of the year, what were my favorite films of the year? What can I showcase there?
And you picked Uncut Gems as number 2, which made me very happy because that was also my
Mhm.
number 2 pick of 2019.
Oh, nice crossover there.
And a lot of people did not like that movie, so I was happy to
Yeah,
see that.
I tried showing that to my dad, and he basically got through the opening credits and said, "I have a headache." It didn't
Yeah,
really work.
I'm almost 100%. I told my parents you have to watch this. It's really interesting, and I think they shut it
Mhm.
off.
Yeah,
They
you
were
have to be in
like,
the right mindset
nope.
for it. Yeah, you got to be ready to embrace the energy of that film and how
Yeah.
kinetic that it is. I'll probably show it to my girlfriend because she's been hoping to
Okay.
see it at some point soon. So that'll be the next one.
Okay, awesome. All right, so that takes us to our film today, which is Johnny Got His Gun. I have a short little synopsis I'm going to read for our listeners who might not know what this
Okay.
film's all about. So Timothy Bottoms plays Joe, a young American soldier hit by a motor shell on the last day of World War I, and he finds himself still alive and conscious in a hospital bed, but in an absolutely horrific state. He's now a quadruple amputee who no longer has his arms, his legs, ears, eyes, mouth, or nose. Is that right?
That's from what I remember. It sounds like you're basically summarizing the lyrics to Metallica's One once again.
Which I probably should have watched before recording this. I didn't. I looked at that trivia, but I haven't actually watched the video.
There are scenes and quotes lifted directly from it.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Like of all the films for them to do a music video like in tribute to this movie.
And that happens a lot. You know, a lot of bands when they choose like pieces for their songs or even just their music video background images, a lot of times it's very obscure pieces like that. So that almost feels like it's their own work. I don't know if that's the intent, but it does come off that way. And that was my thing with Metallica's One, is that I thought it was shot for that video, but that was not the case.
So they made a good choice, picking a little bit more obscure film than something like Back to the Future. Might not have been as
a little too on the nose if that was the case.
All right, so but Joe, he's still able to think, and so we see parts of his life through dreams and through memories. We see glimpses of his love Karen, or Corrine, played by Kathy Fields, his father played by Jason Robards, Jesus Christ himself played by the great Donald Sutherland. Joe continues to be frustrated and obviously devastated by his current situation until finally one day he does find a way to communicate with his caregivers, which kind of leads to the ending of the movie. Any major details I'm leaving out there that our listeners should know about the movie?
No, that's pretty much it. Really, the biggest detail as far as the film aesthetically is how it chooses to kind of showcase the difference between his sense of isolation versus the flashback / dreamlike sequences, which are in color, versus the black and white present day, which is kind of ironic when you think about it. You might think it might be the other way around or something like that.
That's I was going to ask you about that. Like, why choose the modern scenes to be black and white? You know, in a typical film, I feel like in this case, there's so much of the other stuff. It might have been, and especially since the modern day scenes are in kind of one room, it's very spare. It's a lot of white. It kind of makes sense that space would be black and white, especially since he is unable to see his surroundings.
It sort of reminded me a little bit of the Powell and Pressburger film, A Matter of Life and Death from 1946, I believe it was.
That's right.
And I'm not playing my trump card yet. That's not the film I'm going to like recommend with it or anything like that. It's too old. But the way that film juxtaposes black and white with color, you would think that the heaven like sequences would be in color versus the black and white earth, but it's actually the other way around. And I was sort of thinking about that here. And I think it's a really interesting choice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have some background information on the movie I found interesting. I think our listeners will like to hear about. So as I said, this is the only film in his long career Dalton Trumbo actually directed. It's based on his own novel of the same name that came out in 1939. So I was not aware that he had written and published novels. I don't know if there's more than this one, but this is based on a novel he had written decades prior.
Yeah, I believe there are a few, but I can't name them offhand.
Yeah. So he invested $80,000 of his own money in order to attract 25 other investors to get the film made. An uncredited Luis Buñuel wrote the scenes featuring Sutherland as Jesus Christ, or at least the dialogue for Sutherland. Kind of random.
Yeah, of all things.
Okay. Buñuel had the time. Oh, you need dialogue for Jesus. I'm there.
I think it was a smart choice.
Thank you,
not
Luis.
doing it himself. Yeah.
So at a very early stage, Trumbo considered Steve Martin, who was dating Trumbo's daughter at the time, for the role of Joe. So 1971, Steve Martin's first feature film, I believe, is The Jerk, right? From 1979.
I believe so. So that would have
8
spearheaded
years
a completely different
that?
career. Yeah, I, in some ways, I'm kind of glad that didn't happen, because I'm glad we got the career of Steve Martin's that we did.
Yeah, and I feel like this performance might not have aged very well if that's Martin, under the covers with his familiar voice we know and love from so many comedies. That might have been weird.
Pretty distracting nowadays, I guess.
Yeah. Trumbo also wanted Walter Matthau to play Joe's father, but Matthau turned the role down. 1971, Matthau is busy. I've already recorded 2 episodes of the podcast for 1971 movies that both star Walter Matthau. We talked about, A New Leaf, written and directed by Elaine May, her first movie as director. And then Plaza Suite, where he plays 3 different characters, a movie written by Neil Simon. And then at the end of 71, Walter Matthau was in a film called Koch, which I haven't seen, which I'll probably get to later this year. And in for that film, he got an Oscar nomination. So he had a busy 71. He had to turn down some stuff, right?
Yeah. And in this case, we got who'd you say we got? We got Timothy Bottoms instead to play the lead, and we'll talk about it.
So no, Walter Matthau was for the role of the dad. Was for
he's for the role
Jason
of the dad.
Robards part. Yeah,
that would actually make a lot more sense.
I kind of want to see a version of this movie where Jason Robards plays Walter Matthau's dad. That would be kind of fantastic.
Yeah, there's a new thing.
Yeah. But so, yeah, we could have had a different cast. I mean, I'm trying to imagine this movie with Steve Martin and Walter Matthau. Would have been very different. You know, I don't know how much the dramatic scenes would have landed with those two.
I think the satirical scenes would have landed much more directly and bluntly if that was the case.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't see anything about Jesus Christ. I'm assuming just from the beginning, it was Donald Sutherland. Like that's what we wanted for that. Who also has a really interesting, unique character in a small black comedy called Little Murders, which also came out in early 71, directed by Alan Arkin and starring Elliot Gould. We did an episode on that a few months back, so check that out. He's stealing movies left and right. This Donald Sutherland around this time, and still is doing it today. I mean, he's still working today, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and just the year before Johnny Got His Gun, I believe he was in another war-themed movie with MASH, the Robert Altman film.
Yep, MASH came out in January of 1970. Yeah, that right. What a great movie to kick off the decade, right? Like kick off the 70s. Really, one of the first to come out, and that was MASH.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Starring Elliot Gould and Donald Sutherland. So there's some like mixing and matching here. Some of these movies, you see some of the same actors and directors working with each other. Yeah. Things like that. And taking interesting roles that you wouldn't expect, and probably you wouldn't see actors like that doing now, like in projects today.
Yeah.
So Johnny Got His Gun, as I said, it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 1971. It was nominated for the Palme d'Or, and it won the Ferpresky Prize. Is that how you say it? I don't know if you're supposed to like say every letter. And the grand prize of the jury. Trumbo was later nominated for the WGA Award for Best Drama Adapted from Another Medium. And Timothy Bottoms was nominated for the Golden Globe Award for Most Promising Newcomer Male.
I saw that before. We were preparing for this and doing my research, and I have some thoughts. I just
think it's funny. You know, when you go on IMDb and it says like the awards category, it's always like nominated for 1 Golden Globe. Yeah. You'd think the Cannes prizes would be higher up than the Golden Globe, but okay.
Yeah, maybe not the Oscar, but at least for the Golden Globe, I would agree with that. You would think that the prestige of Cannes would be a little bit heavier.
Yeah, exactly. So it's got some awards, got some nominations. It was only a minor hit when released to theaters eventually in August of 1971. Many major film critics, I don't know if you saw this on Wikipedia, a lot of them panned it. A lot of them didn't like it, including Gene Siskel, who gave it less than 3 stars. But as you say, the great Roger Ebert, he gave this film 4 out of 4 stars.
He did.
Now, I will have to say, Brandon, Roger Ebert is giving lots of movies 4 stars in 71. Like I've already talked about like at least 4 or 5 films for the podcast just this spring, where I looked at his review and it's 4 out of 4. I'm like, okay.
He didn't have as much perspective back then, I guess. And that's not to knock Roger Ebert. He's one of the greatest, if not the greatest film critic of all time. But if he loves something, he was very easy to give a quote unquote perfect rating to.
Yeah. Like he gave 4 stars to a kind of a really, a movie that many people don't know about, and that's Cold Turkey, starring Dick Van Dyke and directed by Norman Lear. And his entire review, Brendan, is just a synopsis of the movie. And I don't understand. It's not a film that I imagine anyone would give 4 stars to, but he does, and then he doesn't even explain why.
Okay. He was younger then. I mean, this is 1971 after all. Most of reviews that he has written when he started to improve as a writer, I think was more like in the early 80s and then even into the 90s. I think he and Gene Siskel really kind of came into their own at that time. And that happens to all film critics. You start out with a different perspective, and that perspective sort of, I don't want to say shifts, but it sort of strengthens and becomes a bit more focused as you get older and wiser, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just happy that all of his reviews are available now. I want to say up until right before his death. I think right before his death, the site went live where it had everything, like in early 2013. And so you can go all the way back to 1967 and read his pieces. And yeah, you're right. Some of the early stuff, you can tell that he evolved over many years, but it's great to at least have all that stuff at the beginning.
Yeah, I love the trajectory.
Absolutely. So the one other thing that we've talked about is the film became more well-known in 1989 when it was heavily featured in the Metallica video One. Eventually, the band bought the rights to the film so they could keep showing their video without having to pay royalties, which makes sense.
It does, yeah, because I believe they played it, or at least played a few clips from it during some of their concerts at that time too.
Oh, gotcha. So before
I
buying
believe
the
so.
rights,
Don't hold me to that.
So before buying the rights to the movie, they had to, like, every time they would show the video, or they would have to, like, who were they giving the money to? Like the company behind the movie?
Probably those who had ownership of the movie, and because they were showcasing it at a concert venue that people paid money to see for a different reason.
Oh,
I guess
gotcha.
that kind of creates like a crossing of monetary paths that kind of create some legality issues.
Yeah. So those are my trivia notes about the movie. Did you have anything else to share? Anything
No,
else that you read about?
Really, the only thing was, as we talked about a few times, was my first exposure to this film was sort of by accident, being that music video by Metallica's One. And at that time, I didn't really know anything about what I was seeing. As I mentioned earlier, I thought it was originally shot for that music video. And I always found it very creepy and very unsettling, and really does match almost verbatim the lyrics and the story of that song, especially in the end. If you've listened to it, it gives a direct visual of what our main character even goes through.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so Brendan, what did we think of Johnny Got His Gun just as a movie? What was your take on it? What do you think?
I'm still formulating my thoughts on this one.
I know
actually.
This one's a bit tough, like to just I liked it. Or
this was a daunting task. I finished watching it about a week ago, and I thought, man, I'm in for it this time. I don't even know where to start with this. I will say, about halfway through, my first thought was, this is the kind of movie that I can see Criterion releasing at some point, and not because I think it's good or anything like that. I'll get to my thoughts on the actual film later, but it has the hallmarks of a first-time director, an only-time director, and a name like Dalton Trumbo, and probably what it meant for its themes at the time, especially a reflection of war and faith, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about those as this conversation unfolds. It was perhaps a bit daunting at the time, and maybe even a bit ahead of its time, if you will. And I sort of noticed that, looking at it from that perspective. Watching the movie in the middle of it, as I was sitting there, I didn't really enjoy it, primarily because it's maybe it's not meant to be enjoyed, but there's also this notion that you mentioned. Trumbo funded the film basically himself, and it's definitely a film that looks like it was made on a very limited budget, and perhaps he was sort of pigeonholed to that, which is why some of the filmmaking here is a bit shoddy. And that's one of the things I noticed as a director. I feel like this does have the hallmark of being from a first-time director. You could sort of notice that he's overly ambitious. He trips over his ambitions a lot. But at the same time, as the days went on afterwards, I couldn't really get the film out of my head, because there's something very cold and cynical about the experience, and I weirdly admired that about it. I like movies that do that, especially recognizing that it may have been kind of ahead of its time when it came out in 1971, especially what it was tackling. So it's a film I think I admire more than I enjoyed, but at the same time, I'm really glad I saw it. I'm glad it exists in the way that it does.
Yeah, it's funny you say you admired it more than you enjoyed it. I literally wrote that down almost word for word. I'm really admiring a lot of what Trumbo's doing here. It's ambitious. He's taking risks. I like that, especially for a first-time director. You can clearly see the passion for the project in him.
Yeah.
At the same time, there are some weird editing choices. I couldn't tell if it was my DVD, but the film did not look very good. And I was like, I don't know if this is the disc or if this is the quality of the film. Like, I don't know what the story was there, because a lot of the films I'm looking at for 71 look fantastic. Not even on Blu-ray, just on regular DVD or just on streaming or whatever. So I don't know what that was about. I mean, it has a lot of weird like editing tricks when it like transitions to a new scene. He does like some bells and whistles. I don't know if know if they were needed. And it's not an easy watch. It's really tough when we're with him. He's got the blanket over almost his whole body, and then just you see a little bit of the skin like around his face. And we're sometimes with him for 2-3+ minutes of we're just listening to Timothy Bottom's voiceover, and it's, you know, I'm like, boy, I mean, an hour and 45 minutes of this. You know, sometimes I'm like, maybe this would have worked better as a 10-minute short. You know, like...
I can sort of see that argument. It could be perhaps a bit straining for some people who aren't with it, and especially with regard to some of those editing choices that you're talking about, because the film does have an issue with tone, if you ask me. There are some moments where some of these dreams or flashback sequences, and for the record, I actually do like that you can't really tell what's actually a dream versus what's actually a flashback, or if it's somehow like a metamorphosis of both. And I think in a lot of cases it is. But in some cases, they're meant to be very sad and very, tragic. But in other cases, I kind of sense this heavy dose of satire to them, especially in the back half when it seems as though Joe starts to become a bit more aware of his situation and kind of develops a bit of a sense of humor about it. There's like this dream-like circus act of sorts that he fantasizes about, and it's weirdly funny. And I say weirdly because I'm not sure if I was supposed to be laughing at it. It was almost like cruelly funny. But again, it doesn't really work in the context of the film as a whole. It's kind of messy, but I admire the risk. I admire the choice.
Yeah, it's definitely a film I'm happy I've watched, and I enjoyed a lot of the performances. I thought Timothy Bottom, I mean, he was, Golden Globe nominee for Best Newcomer. So I'm assuming this was like very early on in his career. And I thought since he's hidden for like more than half the movie, I feel like that comes through pretty well in his performance. Like, I think he did a really good job. And then any movie that has Donald Sutherland and Jason Robards, two of my favorite actors, I mean, I'll watch them in anything. And especially Sutherland in this. I mean, you talk about some dark comedy, and just that shot of him hanging off the train and like screaming into the night like a coyote. Okay, this isn't all just deadly serious, because there's some weird stuff going on here.
And that first sequence when we meet Donald Sutherland, who is, as I'm looking at IMDb, he's just credited as Christ. That's how he's credited as. So it's very blunt on that. But the first sequence with him is this blackjack game where all these soldiers seem to be very self-aware and knowledgeable about their deaths. One of them even says, "What's this person doing here? He's not going to be killed." So it's a moment when I realized that these are not just flashback sequences like the initial one with Joe and his girlfriend Corinne. There's this fusion of dream and reality going on here, and I feel like that's kind of the one moment when Donald Sutherland's Christ shows up to kind of epitomize both of those. And again, editing wise, narratively, kind of a mess, but I like the point, and I think that Trumbo is having a little bit of fun, at least, kind of playing with that notion. Like these soldiers that are self-aware about what their impending doom's going to be are still part in this war anyway. I found that notion pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I felt like this movie might have been better if it had been directed by someone else. Maybe Trumbo was a little bit too close to the material.
I was thinking that. Yeah. That happens a lot when you see writers maybe do their own work for the first time, and they hold their work so close to the chest that it kind of puts them in a corner. It's like when like a big epic blockbuster's coming out, like a Star Wars movie, for instance, and J.J. Abrams, who is the biggest Star Wars nerd of all time, is directing it. Maybe that's not the best choice. Now, I'm not saying I disliked his choices. That's a totally different conversation. I don't want to open up that can of worms. But in some cases, being too heavily associated and loving the material might not be the best idea to direct your movie.
Yeah. When you speak of Abrams, like he doesn't want to disappoint anyone, and when you're in that position, it's a little tricky. I mean, does he do his job of delivering a film that brings in everybody, and for the most part people enjoy, but for something a little bit more daring, sometimes you want to go with someone else.
But he's trying things, as we're talking about, and my co-host JD and I on In Session Film, we say this a lot, that we tend to prefer movies that are very bold and daring failures than
Oh
we
yeah.
do just safe mediocrity.
Hmm.
And I feel like this film, Johnny Got His Gun, does fall into that former category.
Hmm.
It might not work, but in some ways, I kind of like that it doesn't work because it's a director trying to be an artist, and
Hmm.
I like that.
That's what's been so interesting about this podcast. There's been very little just safe mediocrity I've looked at since September when I launched this
Yeah,
podcast.
interesting.
Almost every movie, even the ones that don't work for me, I call interesting failures. Like,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
directors are doing something unique and taking risks almost always, which I always
Yeah.
commend, even if the movie doesn't fully work for me. And that's definitely the case with Johnny Got His Gun, which, as hard of a sit it was at times, I really, as I say, admired what Trumbo was doing in a lot
Yeah.
of these moments. I liked a lot of the dialogue. He's obviously a really great dialogue writer. There's some lines I wrote down. At one point, Little Joe says to Robards, he says, "I am going to be unusual."
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
like, I am saying that every day.
I feel like that's Trumbo himself kind of getting a little bit meta with this movie. I'm going to be unusual and make an unusual movie.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case. I'm just hypothesizing there, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was more like if that was Trumbo kind of projecting himself into the story.
Yeah. And that's like the movie. It's like it is
Yeah.
unusual pretty much from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And then Robart says back to him, he says he needs the warmth of his son's arms to keep the chill of death away. Like, there's so many of these like unique lines that I like sat up. I was like, wow, that's really weird. And like, I kind of admire this, because we're getting some bits of this through his dreams and his memories. It's not, I feel like not even when we're getting just kind of a simple moment between father and son, I don't know if we're supposed to take it as 100% reality. There can be a little bit of surrealism there.
Yeah, there is some fusion there, as we've been talking about, and even that scene there between father and son. There's a line about the notion of democracy. You could see that this is where I think Trumbo's getting a little bit, I guess, jabby with his points. I think the father, played by Jason Robards, says democracy is young men killing each other, and in a weird way, he's actually. It seems like he's in support of this notion in some ways, and Joe's kind of the antithesis to that. He doesn't fully embrace those same things, which kind of then gives off this sense that father and son, as loving as it should be to see them together in the way that they embrace, there's a big like indifference between them too. And I think this is where I actually do like the film, and when I think it's at its best is when it does find a way to correlate those sequences with Joe in the present, completely confined, and how he reminisces on those things. I think when there's a through line there, when that connective tissue is there, I feel like the film is actually working. It just doesn't always have that.
Yeah. I feel like there maybe could have been even more of the father and son together. Like, there are stretches of this film where they're, Robards isn't there, and I question if for that to really ring true and for that relationship to be developed to its full potential, I wondered if there could have been a little bit more of them together.
Well, especially since I think Robards probably gives my favorite performance in the movie, at least just in that one scene that we were talking about just a few minutes ago. I think he is quite great, and he's a veteran actor. We know he's going to be great in almost everything he's been in, but here I feel like he does do a very good job creating that tonal balance that I think the film doesn't always have. He seems to know exactly where he needs to tone it back, or I guess ham it up a little bit if he ever does. I think it's well balanced in that regard.
Yeah, Robards doing great work throughout the 1970s. If you haven't seen it, check out his 1970 Western, The Ballad of Cable Hogue, which was one of my favorite films I looked at last year for the podcast. I didn't do an episode of that one, but I did watch it for 1970s. Really good.
Okay.
Came out a little bit earlier in the year. And then he would go on to, I believe, win back-to-back Oscars for Best Supporting Actor. The first one for All the President's Men, and the second one for Julia.
I believe that was back to back. Yeah, I don't know offhand. Yeah, it's incredible.
So it's pretty rare when that happens back to back, but he was able to pull that off. And yeah, he's one of those. He can be in a film for a scene or two, and he will be what you remember weeks on.
And I feel like that's the case here. It's not just Jason Robards, but it is also Donald Sutherland. I feel like he's probably the next closest here to being a veteran actor. Maybe not a veteran actor at the time, but now we look at him as one. And you can even tell at his age here in 1971, he was stealing scenes. He was standing out in every way he should be.
Yeah, if you want to see him steal scenes, watch Little Murders. He has one scene and it's incredible. Like the movie as a whole is just okay. And then he has this monologue in one scene halfway through that just blows you out of your seat. It's so great. It's like fantastic. He just, he came in for one day and did this scene, and it's the best scene of the movie.
Yeah.
And then he would be in Klutz later this year, which we'll talk about this coming June with Jane Fonda. Sutherland is also in Klutz, directed by Alan Jake Pakula. That came out in the summer of 71. Okay. And then we're 2 years out from Don't Look Now, the really great thriller directed by Nicholas Roeg and also starring Julie Christie. So that's coming up soon. So yeah, I mean, I believe Sutherland's career started like in the late 60s. I mean, this is not a guy, who had a ton of credits before, but he's already early in his career doing really interesting projects.
Yeah, for sure. And it's good to bring them up as good performers here, because we mentioned Timothy Bottoms and you talked about how good he is in those sequences in the present day when it's only just his voice, because in those sequences, I do think he is quite good. And I think that's probably why he garnered that really interesting Golden Globe nomination for Most Promising Newcomer, which I believe has been discontinued. I've never seen that one.
Why'd they get rid of that, Brendan?
I don't know. I'm not an awards junkie. But I could see why he would get that nomination, simply because most of this movie is just his voice. I do think in those flashback sequences, when it is him, I don't think he's very good. And maybe
a little stiff. Yeah,
very stiff, actually. That whole first flashback sequence with his girlfriend,
the
Corinne,
romance,
played by Kathy Fields, it's really bad. It's really stiff, and it really does a bad job setting the tone for the rest of the film when that's one of the first things that actually happens. I think that occurs maybe 10 minutes into it. So it's not a very good start. And I mean, maybe it's supposed to be a little bit stiff. Maybe this goes back into our argument that it's meant to be kind of ambiguous or dreamlike in some way, and maybe that's meant to evoke this sense of stilted confusion or something like that. Or I'm just giving Trumbo too much credit there, and he just didn't know how to direct them. I'm kind of leaning towards the latter. But aside from those sequences, the ones you brought up when it's just his voice, I think he is quite good.
So you wanted Bottoms to just stay covered the whole movie?
Perhaps, yeah. Nothing against him.
We like you when you don't have a face.
Exactly, yeah. Or his arms or his legs. Just rip everything off.
Yeah, so I don't know if you were thinking this at all watching it. I thought there was an extreme coldness to not being able to even see his eyes, right? And I questioned, I mean, this isn't based on a true story, is it? Because I'm just like, why does he have to have, like, it's one thing for him to have his arms and legs not there, but like, I feel like there'd be more of an emotional pull for the audience if we could see his face for those scenes where he could be catatonic, like he could be like he can't move his face. But like you can't even see his eyes. So we have these scenes where we're just seeing like a covered face. You see a little bit of his cheeks and that's a neck, and that's about it. And it's just we're hearing his voiceover for minutes on end. I thought, I don't know, just for a cinematic film, I feel like I want to see his eyes, at least.
No, I get you. And I believe what Trumbo's intent was, if I'm just going to try and, hypothesize what he's going for thematically, is to take a character and strip every ounce of humanity away from him to see how much we can still retain. And perhaps that's what he's trying to do, which then includes, his sight, his hearing. Really all he has left is his sense of touch, really. And he has to find a way to kind of utilize that as yet another way to continue living if he chooses to do that. But you do make a good point that, is it possible that Trumbo just went a little bit too far with that idea? And it just gives us as an audience less to latch on to, because all we have is Timothy Bottoms' voice. And I do think he is very good in those sequences, but you need a really talented actor, not just a physical actor, but also a voice actor, to be able to carry that with all of those missing pieces. And I do think Bottoms mostly gets there. I think he's good enough, but perhaps that component that you're talking about could have helped strengthen that a little bit more.
Yeah, especially at the end. I mean, this movie, I won't give away like exactly how it ends, but it's definitely a downer ending, a very haunting final shot. And even just there, I thought, wow, if we could just see his eyes just for that last shot, I feel like it would have more power. I don't know.
Yeah, that sense of fear that he's obviously, maybe not even fear, but just this like this realization that it's not going the way that he wants, because he makes a choice, he makes an action that is not honored, I'll simply say.
Yeah.
And he's obviously grappling with that. And all we have, as we said, is just his voice to, convey that. And it's mostly there, but perhaps there is something there missing.
Yeah. And then the other thing, I don't know if this bothered you at all. I wanted a little bit more of like the World War I. Like I'm thinking it's because he didn't have it in the budget, right? I'm assuming it was a budgetary thing.
Perhaps.
But we don't really see much like of the actual war itself. And I kind of wondered about that. Just the moment of like what happened to him. I feel like that could have added something to the movie. But we get like just a little bit. Like we get some with like Sutherland and some of the soldiers, but we don't get a whole lot of like actual war action of any kind.
No, we get very little, and maybe that was budgetary, or maybe it was Trumbo's intent. He wanted to make a movie that was less just about war, and maybe about other things, because I think this movie is also making commentaries on Christianity and faith as well. And I do think he's able to offset some of those missing pieces with other thematic ideas. At the same time, it goes back to this idea of a first director getting a bit overly ambitious. I think there are sometimes too many ideas going on here. But I think that's what he's trying to do with those missing pieces of war. We don't see a lot of World War I. At the same time, perhaps seeing that could have helped create this visceral sense, this tension that I think the film is trying to have, that coldness that we keep talking about, and it probably could have been strengthened a little bit more by having it. I think it may have been budgetary, and he just tried to offset it with other ideas.
Yeah, that might be the case. We just talked about a film recently on the podcast called The Beguiled, where it's set in the 1800s, and Clint Eastwood is a wounded soldier who's taken in by this school of women, and you don't know how he got injured until about halfway through the movie, and we get this really vivid, terrifying flashback of him being shot, and it like really, you go, oh wow, okay, so you get a little bit of context as to how he got to be wounded, where we don't really get that here. I just kind of wondered if that was a budgetary thing or not, but it doesn't bring the movie down by any means, because I think it's not really about the war. It's more about him and the aftermath of his wounds and everything. But
and I believe Roger Ebert said in his review for this film was that it's not really an anti-war film. It's more of a pro-life film. And I don't think he means that from like an abortion angle or anything that. I think he means about celebrating a life to have and the choices that you should be given to make. And I believe that's what Trumbo is trying to do. He's mostly using war as sort of a cipher to get us to that point, because there are other things that spearhead from that, like Christianity, like democracy. It's a very political movie in that sense too. So there's a lot of ideas that complement that notion.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else you want to mention about Dalton Trumbo as a director here, or any of the performances we have not talked about? Anything else you want to add about any of that?
Yeah, what's her name? The one that plays the main nurse, Diane Varsi, I believe it is, the one that actually takes
at
pity
the end. Yeah.
She pity on Joe in a way, and also in a very creative way finds ways to communicate with him, and in some ways that sort of pushes him to this turning point that maybe he can still find a reason to live and a sense of joy in that. And there's almost this one glimmer of hope that she's able to bring him. And without getting too much into detail as far as what happens in the end, that joy is kind of stripped away, I'll simply say. But I do like that Trumbo, as well as Varsi's performance, they do add a brief moment of levity to the film, because I do think at that moment it needed that. Otherwise, it would have been way too cold, way too cynical, and way too distancing for audiences. But I like what she's able to bring to it. I think it adds a nice new component.
Yeah. Speaking of Clint Eastwood, we do not get the $1 Million Baby ending.
Well, I will say that was one of the movies I was probably going to talk about.
Oh, okay, nice. We'll get to it.
I'll think of another one.
Yeah, but no, we can talk about $1 Million Baby, which is a great film. But yeah, I agree. I think she did a really strong job, especially at the end, just that shot where the realization is kind of like that sense of disappointment. I think that's handled really well.
Yeah, I think she's great.
Yeah, and then in terms of Dalton Trumbo as a director, as I said before, he's taking risks here. He's clearly really passionate about this material, maybe a little bit too much, but I'm always like of the sense of when, even if a celebrated screenwriter who, had film credits for many decades, even if it's only one film that they direct, I'm glad that we have that rather than nothing, because I feel like when a screenwriter takes on the directing debut, you get to really see what they're made of, and because it goes beyond just the words. And for the most part, I think he did a lot of really interesting things in this movie.
I agree with that, and he may trip over his ambitions quite often. But as we keep beating a dead horse here, I'd rather see directors trip over their ambitions
Yep.
rather than just play it safe. And he does not play it safe here at all.
And so you've talked about faith and some of the thematic ideas of this movie. Was there anything else you wanted to add about just kind of what Trumbo was going for here beyond just what the movie's about, like the ideas he was trying to express?
Well, I do think, going back to Roger Ebert's review, I actually think he hit the nail on the head by calling this a quote unquote pro-life movie. And that it is basically a celebration of your own power, regardless of how you're stripped away from that. And even in those final moments, our lead character, Joe, despite his limitations, he still finds a way to hold on to some sense of agency. And that's really the emotional turning point of the film, where I think its message is. He's able to disregard these, I guess, superficial notions of what governs our lives, whether it be politics or Christianity. Some people hold these vices a bit too close to the chest. And I think Trumbo is more interested in how we can, recognize that those vices exist, but they're not what defines what we choose to do. And sadly, the film doesn't really go in favor of Joe and what we want to see celebrated. But I think that's the message, is using those trivial things to emphasize, we're our own people.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. All right. So my final question, Brendan, about this movie, unless you have anything else you want to say about it, I wanted to ask you what I ask of each of my guests is, if they were to remake this movie 50 years on in 2021 and the 2020s, like what would stay the same from the 1971 version, and what do you think a modern day director would change? How would the story be presented in the way we look at films now, kind of looking at this movie through a 2021 lens?
Oof, that's a really good question. I feel like it can go a multitude of ways, I guess, depending on who's making it and what sensibilities are behind the camera, because I could see it being a very schmaltzy kind of movie in some ways, a very Spielbergian kind of movie, if you will. Or I could see it feeling very much like one of those independent A24 horror films of sorts, trying to maintain that
make
sense
it
of
really gruesome and terrifying.
And I think if we're trying to find the closest comparison to what we actually got in 1971, I would guess it would probably be more in that latter kind of vein. I could see it trying to hold on to that coldness, that cynicism, but it might just try and emphasize the horror of this situation with some more filmmaking trickery, maybe a lot of long takes. I could see a lot of long takes being used in this movie, trying to build dread and tension. So from a filmmaking angle, I can see it going that way. But from a thematic angle, this movie was very ahead of its time with its cynical notions on faith and stuff, even despite its, I guess, hopeful message on life and existence. But a lot of that thematically has been kind of done before since then. I don't think it's not ahead of its time now. In fact, nothing's really ahead of its time nowadays, I feel like. But it would almost feel potentially trite. So I'm not really sure how it can tackle the same themes and ideas in a way that feels kind of new. It would have to take a new spin on it. But I'm not sure what that spin would be. Maybe even more cynical, maybe even more hopeless. I don't know.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of ways to take it. I do think we wouldn't get quite as much of the modern day where he's got covered. I feel like we'd get little glimpses of that occasionally, but it wouldn't be so much of that throughout the movie.
Right.
I also think we'd get more of young Joe, and I think we'd get more of the war itself. That would probably be something added to a newer version.
Agreed.
But yeah, I mean, I think some of the thematic ideas, some could be changed. I don't know if there'd be a Jesus Christ. Maybe.
In our social climate, I feel like that might be pushing it a little bit nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. I even think it could work maybe as like a limited series, like a 6-part series or something, where we could kind of go into his life in different stages. Could also be interesting too.
I can see that, with each episode basically functioning as that new stage of sorts.
Yeah, like having one episode be all about the father, right?
Yeah.
And not have it be going back and forth all the way through.
Yeah,
could,
and maybe have maybe have a different director for each different phase to kind of give it like a new visualization, especially if it's meant to have dreamlike qualities.
Yeah.
So each director can have their own unique visual flair to it to make it very new and different and frightening for the actual main character.
The final episode of him, without the eyes, without the nose, covered up, that could be David Lynch.
Oh, yeah. It's the unofficial sequel to like either Elephant Man or Eraserhead.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, overall, I would give this movie, because I do my ratings just like the great Roger Ebert. I started reading film criticism in the 90s, looking at Leonard Maltin and Roger Ebert. So I've always been doing the 4 out of 4 stars and that kind of thing.
Sure.
I would give this probably 2.5 out of 4. Kind of like an interesting movie. I'm glad I watched it. It's not one I'll probably ever watch again, but I'm glad I watched it.
I'm kind of in that same boat, at least just based on my subjective reaction to it. Yet, if I am going to try and give a little more objectivity towards it, I mean, there are things about it that I want to veer. Okay, maybe it's more of a 3-star movie because of its daring ideas and stuff. But the execution, some of the performances, some of the crazy editing, it's maybe more of a 2-star movie or something like that. It's so okay, 2.5 stars. We'll meet in the middle. It's math.
Perfect. I love it. So yeah, if you're a fan of Dalton Trumbo's work, if you like Jason Robards, if you like Donald Sutherland, I kind of feel like this is one you should take a look at. And it's not super long. What was it, like an hour and 45 minutes? It's not like
something like that.
I've looked at a couple films for the podcast that are 2.5 hours or longer.
Yeah.
I think if this movie had been 2.5 hours, would have been deadly.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I think it's brief enough to the point that it wasn't too unbearable.
Yeah, exactly. So that takes us to our final 2 segments. The first one is called the Divine Double Feature. That's where we pick a more modern film that we think could make like a really interesting double feature with Johnny Got His Gun. So right when this movie ends, Brendan, what would be kind of an interesting newer movie that someone could watch right after it that's similar in tone or similar in genre or whatever it may be, or similar in ideas, that can also kind of show the evolution of cinema itself? Like what's something that more modern someone could watch?
Yeah, I was thinking about talking about $1 Million Baby just from the euthanasia angle. But I feel like that's a little too spoilery when it comes to Johnny Got His Gun, and we want to try and avoid that. So I have another film in the back of my mind. I was looking at it more from a filmmaking standpoint because the ideas presented here, the fact that it is a man that's limited mobily, limited in many ways. We only hear his voice. And we also even get a very devout nurse to sympathize and help communicate with him. I was thinking about the diving bell and the butterfly. That was the first thing that came to mind about halfway through. Yeah, directed by Julian Schnabel from 2007. Easily in my top 5 favorite films from that year. Which, I mean, that's saying something considering that 2007 was probably the greatest cinematic year.
Fantastic year.
Yeah. But that film was one of my introductions to foreign language films, which ironically, it's not really a foreign language film because it was an American production and was directed by an American director. Too. It was just spoken in French because of the biography and the fact that it was about a French man. But the directional choices that Schnabel makes, I think, are very comparable to what Trumbo is trying to go for, just a bit more literal in that sense. So for that reason, aesthetically speaking, I think they do kind of correlate.
That's a great choice. It's fun. As you were describing it, I'm like, oh my God, the diving bell and the butterfly. I did not even think of that movie until you were just talking about it now. I was like, oh, that's a great idea, because there are a lot of similarities, and you could see, so that, what would that have been? I mean, 36 years later to kind of see some of the evolution of film. That's fantastic. So before I get to my choice, I did want to mention that just the idea of someone not being able to talk is dealt with in a really interesting episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, directed by Alfred Hitchcock himself. That's an episode from season 1 called Breakdown, starring the great Joseph Cotten. And he like gets in a car accident, and we see most of the episode from his point of view. He's still alive, but he can't move. He can't move his eyes, can't move his limbs. And so we see like the people arriving, and they're like ready to put him, in the morgue, right? They're like, oh, he's dead. And so we're in his head, like as we're hearing his thoughts, like, oh my God, they think I'm dead. I'm not dead, but he can't speak. It's one of my favorite episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. I believe it was like 55 or 56. And it's worth a look.
I'm trying to remember if I've seen it. The way you've described it kind of sounds familiar, because that used to play on rotation in my childhood home. My parents would sometimes have it on, and man, this is triggering some massive deja vu right now.
Yeah, I was a big Twilight Zone fan as a kid. My dad loved the Twilight Zone. So when I was like 8, 9, 10, he was showing me a bunch of Twilight Zones. It wasn't until I was older that I discovered Alfred Hitchcock Presents, because I'm such a big Hitchcock fan. And I'm like, oh, Hitchcock actually directed some of these himself. He directed like at least 7 or 8 of them. And so I watched some of the ones he directed, and that might have been my favorite. It's one that's always stuck in my mind. So check that out if you haven't seen it. But in terms of a modern film, I went with something super obvious. I struggled with this one. I was just like, because one of my criticisms was, well, we don't really get any of actual World War One. I went with one of my other favorites from 2019, and that's 1917, which I just thought was similarly, ambitious, a really ambitious World War One film directed by Sam Mendes. And also a younger person in war. And instead of Johnny Got His Gun, where we don't really see the war at all, almost not at all, then to kind of go right into a movie that completely immerses the viewer into the war by having it feel like one long take for 2 hours or whatever it is, that just floored me when I saw it in the theater. I haven't seen it a second time, but boy, that opening night in a crowded audience, one of the 2 or 3 last films I saw with a crowded audience in early 2020. I still think about that movie. I really thought it was fantastic. And I thought Sam Mendes did such a great job. I thought that would be kind of an interesting way to look at film, 48 years later.
Especially from the war angle, for sure. Yeah. And you were talking about it kind of, Johnny Got His Gun specifically not having some of those very direct war allusions. It was sort of missing those pieces. And if it was maybe remade today, or at least made again today for the first time, if it did have some of those war sequences, I can imagine them being visceral in maybe a similar way that 1917 was. And speaking to that movie specifically, I really wish I saw that in a crowded theater. I saw that at home as a screener.
Okay. No, it worked. I saw it in a big theater, totally crowded, opening night, and one of the biggest screens we have in Reno, and it was pretty stunning. The sound, the sound of it, the look of it was amazing.
Yeah, that's how a lot of members of my family saw it, and they came back saying, "Oh, Brendan, you have to see this movie. It's so good." And I watched it at home, probably not the best way, and I thought, yeah, it's good. I personally didn't love it. I had some minor issues with it, but I think from a technical standpoint, it's kind of immaculate.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that takes us to our final segment, which is called Beyond the Flick. That's where we take an actor or a director or genre affiliated with the movie and talk about them a little bit more broadly. So because this is his only movie as director, I thought this would be a great episode to talk about Dalton Trumbo and his long career in Hollywood. So obviously we're going to just look at films that he wrote, since the only one he directed we just talked about. So what are a few of your favorites? And anything else you want to share about Trumbo's life that you know of? I mean, I wrote a couple things down here about his kind of fascinating life in Hollywood. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, very fascinating life, and the fact that he had many different pseudonyms and fronts for a lot of these movies that he did, right? Because he was part of the Hollywood 10 and was blacklisted for having, I think he was an isolationist, if I'm not mistaken, or something like that. But he had ties to the Communist Party. I guess they accused him of being a sympathizer of sorts. I don't know all the details, but that's basically what led him to being blacklisted with many other Hollywood elite at the time that had some of those same accusations, essentially. Which is why a movie like Roman Holiday, which is widely regarded as probably one of the best films he's written, he wasn't even credited for it. He won the Oscar for it, I guess, was it 40 years later in 1993, when they basically gave him a new statue for it, honoring him
after he had died
posthumously. We have to make that tidbit known because he died in 76, as you were talking about earlier. But as far as some of his films that he wrote, which ones are my favorites? I mean, I mentioned Roman Holiday. You can't talk about Trumbo and not bring up Roman Holiday, and it is a film that I do really like. A few reservations here and there, but what works the best is the dialogue and the writing. I think that ending especially, I think, is pitch perfect, and it saves the entire movie for me. And a lot of that is because of what is there on the page. At least I would assume so. So Roman Holiday's up there. He's got a lot of very well-known films tied to his name, like Spartacus or Exodus. Papillon, the prison movie, Papillon. Which I haven't seen in a while, but I wasn't a big fan of it personally. And a lot of these, if I'm not fans of them, it's maybe because of other factors outside of the writing, maybe the direction or something like that. But I do want to signal out two of his movies that I don't think get talked about as much that I do really enjoy. One of them's Gun Crazy.
Okay.
Which
Writing it down.
Yeah, I believe that came out in 1950, if I'm not mistaken.
That title looked familiar. I was like, where have I heard that?
Yeah, it's a very charming movie in some ways. There's a kind of a fetishistic quality that it kind of has to it too that I think gets overlooked, but it has a really great meet cute between John Hall and Peggy Cummins that I think is really great, and has a great heist afterwards that I think is quite good too. And there's another movie called Lonely Are the Brave, starring Kirk Douglas, Gina Rowlands, and Walter Matthau. It's a Western of sorts.
Wow. How have I not seen that?
Yeah.
Great cast.
It's good. It's quite good. So I'd say between those two and Roman Holiday, those are probably the two that stand out to me the most. And some of them I haven't seen in a while, but I remember really enjoying them at the time.
Yeah, so I don't have any surprises here. The three of his films that he wrote that I've seen, really the only three, I think. There might have been one other one, but Papillon from 1973, I believe. So I'll get to that on the podcast. I've only seen it the one time. I did, a few years back, I looked at a lot of the older Dustin Hoffman movies, starting with The Graduate, just kind of looking at some of his other works. And it wasn't in my top 3 or 4, but boy, if you want to look at an actor in one decade, look at Dustin Hoffman. Like his like between like 67 Graduate to 1982 Tootsie. I mean, it's just one terrific performance after another.
Yeah.
And some that I hadn't really heard of before, like Straight Time from 1978, which is fantastic. And obviously his Oscar-winning role in Kramer versus Kramer.
Right.
Papillon, I remember liking. I enjoyed the kind of the banter between him and Steve McQueen, which is another actor I really enjoy. So yeah, that'd be my number 3 of Trumbo's films I've looked at. And the number 2, I'd put Roman Holiday, which was, I mean, Audrey Hepburn, she'd been in a couple things before that, right? But this was like her big debut starring role, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, right? It was a very big deal for her. Also, the fact that she did really cut her hair on screen, if I'm not mistaken. So there was like some meta qualities that made her stand out even further. And again, going back to that film, she's really the big reason why that film works.
Oh yeah,
her innocence, her charm. I could have gotten a whole movie of just her walking around Rome, just experiencing life outside of royalty. Like I could have done with all of that.
And she's just stunningly gorgeous, has so much charisma. This would kick off a stretch of films between 1953 and 1967. A lot of great stuff like Sabrina, which I enjoy. She made 2 films in 67 right before she kind of semi-retired. I would think just she wanted to be a mom. But 2 for the Road and Wait Until Dark, like 2 great movies that came out right at the end of like her reign in Hollywood. That you should definitely check out. Too. And I really I hadn't seen it until a few years ago. I really also enjoyed Charade with Cary Grant is super fun. It's like the closest of that era. It's like the closest film that feels like a Hitchcock movie, but that's actually not Hitchcock.
Yeah. It's
like
very North by Northwest in some ways.
I think it just came out of 3 or 4 years after North by Northwest. So yeah, Roman Holiday would be my number 2. And then my number 1 would be Spartacus. I've seen it 4 or 5 times. If I want to see a big giant epic with the great Kirk Douglas, directed by the great Stanley Kubrick, I really like that one. Do you not like Spartacus?
I haven't seen it in a long time, so that's the main reason why I didn't bring it up here.
Okay. It's probably been 5 to 7 years. I can't remember a whole lot about it, but
and it's hard to just sit back and rewatch an epic like that. That's over 3 hours long. Yeah,
but I did see it in a theater. It came to Reno, I want to say 7-8 years ago, and I saw it in a theater, like a giant screen, and it was a lot of fun.
Is that your first time seeing it then too?
Yeah, I think I'd seen it once in high school, but I remember I did a weekend in high school where I watched Ben-Hur and Spartacus back to back.
Wow,
that was a long afternoon.
Yeah, a lot of potty breaks in that one.
But yeah, sometimes I like, especially when it comes to films of like the 50s, early 60s, sometimes I really like those big spectacle movies, the films they were making to draw the audience back in, because we had television, so a lot of the audiences were staying home. So they had to lure them in somehow. And Spartacus is one of my favorites of those kinds of films that came out over about 10-year period.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially when you watch them nowadays, because they are so big and all in camera and everything is all, physically in place, it wouldn't be like what Ridley Scott does nowadays with his epics that are all, computer enhanced to be as big as possible. I mean, you watch a movie like Lawrence of Arabia from David Lean, and just a 4-minute shot of someone coming from miles away in the desert is somehow the most beautiful thing you'll see, because it's all physical, it's all there, it's all tangible, and I think that's why in a lot of ways these epics hold up because of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. There is something tangible to everything you look at in these big epic films from that era. Even Cleopatra from '63, which I have some problems with, is not a great movie. Everything you're seeing is there. So there's something kind of exciting about that.
Yeah, for sure.
You don't get that now. We're just kind of programmed now to anything we watch. Every single shot is a visual effect in a big epic. You're like, okay, only the actor is there. Everything else is made up. And we've just kind of gotten used to that.
Yeah, which is kind of a scary thought when you say it that way. Us getting used to it.
Like, just a few nights ago, speaking of epics, I looked at the Zack Snyder's Justice League, which is 4 hours long. And I'm asking myself, is there a shot of this movie that hasn't been worked on?
Anyway. Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't watched it yet myself, but I wouldn't be surprised if, every single angle of that movie is somehow enhanced in some digital way.
Yeah. So there's a qualities to some of those older epics that I really like, and Spartacus is one of them.
Yeah, there are a couple. Spartacus, you talk about Trumbo and just his ability to be a good writer. I mean, a lot of that wonderful ending and just how quotable that it is primarily because of what was on the page. So you have to thank Trumbo for that.
And I believe Spartacus and Exodus were the two films that got his name back on the screen. I believe it was Kirk Douglas, right, who was fighting to get Dalton Trumbo's name in the movie.
I believe so, yeah. I haven't seen Exodus, so I don't know as far as how that film holds up from a quality standpoint, but I do believe those two simultaneous epics were sort of what spearheaded, or I guess re-spearheaded, Trumbo's career in that sense.
So he had 3 nominations for Best Screenplay in his long career. The first one was for Kitty Foyle with Ginger Rogers, and made in the 40s. That movie actually has his name in the credits. So that's the only time he was nominated for something at a ceremony where they said Dalton Trumbo. Right? Yeah. And then in the 50s, he wins the Oscar for Roman Holiday. And then just a few years after that, he wins an Oscar for The Brave One, which came out in 56.
Which I have seen, actually.
Okay.
It's on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
And I actually, in preparation for this show, I decided to catch up with that, thinking, I wonder if this is a hidden gem in Trumbo's filmography. And it's cute. It's cute. I actually admire a lot about it. I think musically and visually, it's actually quite great. The film is directed by Irving Rapper. But I believe, it was a movie that Trumbo was not credited on with his name. I think he was under the pseudonym Robert Rich for that. But I believe he also won the Best Story award at the Oscars, which doesn't exist anymore. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, The Brave One was the last movie to ever get that award.
Okay.
They continued it.
And I want to say the movie Trumbo from 2015 with Bryan Cranston, isn't there a scene where he watches from television him winning his first or second Oscar? And they're saying a name that's not his, but he's still well, it's kind of me.
Okay, now that you say that, that does sound familiar.
Yeah. So and I would recommend that. I kind of like to watch it a second time. I really enjoyed it when I watched it. The Trumbo, which was directed by, was it the director of Meet the Parents, Jay Road?
Yeah, of all people.
Yeah, who's definitely
also do Dinner for Schmucks. I forget. He did something like that.
He's kind of been all, he's done some dramas, and has he done a lot of political films and things?
A few.
Game Change and those kind of movies.
Was The Campaign another one with Will Ferrell and Zack Galifianakis?
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, he directed Trumbo, and I remember it had an incredible cast. Diane Lane was in it, and it was a lot of fun. If you like Hollywood history, I don't know. I mean, I was a little disappointed by Mank, which was a big 2020 release and is the most nominations. For me, a movie like Trumbo was a little bit more fun. I could really enjoy Trumbo more so than a movie like Mank.
I definitely preferred Mank because of the vision behind it. But I will say, at least with Trumbo, what I remember of the movie, at least back in 2015, it doesn't fall into a lot of the trappings that most biopics tend to fall into these days, especially music biopics. They have a tendency to tell you everything. They go into this like Wikipedia style storytelling that we like to call it. And it's a problem. It makes it way too emotionally limiting. It's hard to latch on to who the person is. It's just about what they did. At least Trumbo kind of had a bit of a focal point from what I remember. You know, there was that idea of him being blacklisted and getting so much work despite his name being on hardly anything at the time. And I think in that sense, it's a better angle, or at least it's a right angle for a biopic like that.
Yeah, when it came to Mank, something that lacked for me was just like the part of it where it's just about the writing process, where I think that Trumbo did a better job. Just when it's about the actual writer trying to complete his newest project, I feel like the process of writing was handled a little bit better in Trumbo, but they're both really solid films. If you want to learn more about Trumbo's life, I would definitely recommend the 2015 film starring Bryan Cranston, who does a great job in that.
Yeah,
in that
he's
movie.
great in it.
Yeah. All right, so that takes us to the end here, Brendan. This has been so much fun to talk to you today about Johnny Get His Gun. Johnny got his gun.
God is good.
I am never, I am never going to get this title right as long as I live. Johnny, get your gun.
Yeah, I like that better.
This was a lot of fun. So yeah, to end here, I'd love for you to tell us like where our listeners can find you online, where they can find you on social media channels, or find your writing or podcasting. Now would be the time to tell us.
Yeah, for sure. Once again, I mentioned that we're on In Session Film, and you can find basically everything at insessionfilm.com. That's our actual website there. And we're also available on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook by just simply searching at In Session Film. But if you want to follow me directly, because my co-host usually handles a lot of the social media platforms, but you can find me on Twitter at Brendan J. Cassidy. So I do all my controversial, not controversial, I hate controversy when it comes to film. My polite tweets, my open, I'll go there. So if you want to follow me there, I do a lot of commenting on not just film, but I'm also kind of a music junkie. I have a bit of a encyclopedia knowledge when it comes to music. I play in a band as well, so I try and share a bunch of stuff there too. It's just trying to stay, active artistically in some way.
Fantastic. I would love to have you back on the podcast at some time. This has been such a thrill. So thanks again, Brendan, for being here.
Great. Of course.
And thanks to all of you for listening. You can find us online at filmat50.com. We're on all the socials, and at podcasts at the patreon.com/filmat50. If you want to check out some bonus episodes and support the podcast. Until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.